They call me Nona Rose now. In the mornings, children knock on my gate for sweet bread rolls or the sugared figs I hang to dry under the pergola. They know the sound of my cane against the cobblestones and wave when they see my silhouette in the window. I am the woman who grows lavender along the stone path and plays old Italian waltzes on the gramophone while hanging linens in the sun. But I wasn't always this person. I live now in a small house on the outskirts of Montova, in a quiet stretch where gardens bloom behind low stone walls and every door still opens, with a key you can hear turning from across the street. I chose this place for its silence, not the silence of absence, but of peace, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. This morning I rose before the sun. It was the feast of Saint Agnes, my mother's name, though she never lived up to the purity of her patron. The air was cool and smelled of last night's rain. I lit a single candle in front of her old icon, chipped and darkened by time. A habit, not of forgiveness, but acknowledgement, that she existed, that she failed me, that I lived anyway. The kettle whistled. I poured my tea and opened the kitchen. Shutters. The sky was pearl grey, the kind of morning that doesn't promise joy but doesn't threaten sorrow either. I sat with my tea at the table, fingers wrapped around the cup, letting the warmth sink into my bones. 78 years of living, and some days, my body still feels like the prison it was when I was a child. On the wall opposite me hangs a single photo, black and white, cracked at the corners. A girl in braids stands on the front step of a crumbling house, her expression uncertain, one eye squinting into the sun. I was 9 in that photo. It was taken 2 months after he left. My father, the man I was told to stop mentioning by the time I turned 10. He left with a note on the table and a suitcase half packed. No explanation, no goodbye. Just a gap in the doorway where his body had been. And then there was only her, my mother. Agnes. People say children remember pain differently, that their minds protect them by softening the edges, sanding down the worst. That may be true for some, but I remember everything. She didn't cry when he left, didn't ask where he'd gone. Instead, she stared at me for a long time, and then said quietly, as if to herself, "He didn't take you." Of course he didn't. Then she turned and swept the crumbs from the table as though nothing had changed. That winter, the air inside our house turned to glass. You couldn't move without feeling something sharp beneath the skin. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice cracked like dry branches. She'd sit by the fire darning socks that never fit and mutter things under her breath. Just like him. His eyes. That mouth. She looked at me as if I were his ghost haunting her kitchen. I began walking on the edges of the floorboards, to avoid creaking. I learned the rhythm of her moods by the sound of her footfalls on the stairs. I became a student of fear, its patterns, its breath, its smell. Once, in early spring, I came home with a ribbon in my hair, a gift from a neighbor girl who'd braided it in during recess. My mother ripped it out before I could take off my coat. "Don't you ever come in here looking like that again," she hissed. He used to buy me ribbons, before I became a fool. I didn't understand, but I knew better than to ask. The worst day came on my 8th birthday. I had saved a slice of apple from my school lunch and wrapped it in paper to share with her, foolishly thinking that maybe kindness worked both ways. I left it on the counter with a note in clumsy cursive. "For you, Mama. Happy to be your daughter." I returned from the bathroom. The note was in the fireplace, curling into smoke. The slice of apple lay crushed on the floor. She stood over it, hands clenched. "Don't lie to me," she said. "You're not happy. And I never asked for a daughter that looked like him." That night was the first time I tasted blood from the inside of my cheek. And yet the next morning, I rose and made the bed and walked to school, as if I were not a child unraveling. The neighbors called her elegant. "Your mother walks like a queen," said one woman on our street. "So proud, so dignified." Dignity, I learned, can be performed like theatre. All you need is a stiff collar and a closed mouth. She went to Mass every Sunday and sang louder than the rest. She made soup for sick parishioners and hosted novenas in our parlor. She knew the names of the priests and the ages of all their sisters. No one ever asked what she was like when the curtains were drawn. No one ever asked me anything. And so I learned to smile at the right times, to keep my bruises where they couldn't be seen, to answer questions with yes, signora, and no, maestra. I memorized the lines of safety and stayed behind them. I built the version of myself the world would not look too closely at. A quiet girl, a polite girl, a girl who would disappear by simply blinking. I sip the last of my tea now, my bones aching as the light grows stronger through the window. A small finch lands on the sill, its feathers puffed, head tilted as if curious. "You're early," I say aloud. My voice still startles me when I speak it before noon. In the distance, I hear the bakery's bell ring open. Another day begins. In a town that remembers me as kind. And maybe I am kind. But that kindness is not a gift I was given. Is the weapon I forged from every blow that failed to break me. I've never returned to that house. The one on Via dei Pioppi with the green shutters that never quite closed. I still remember the way the wooden slats bowed outward from the frame, as if the whole house had swollen with secrets too long unspoken. It was the kind of place people called carina quaint, picturesque especially in spring, when the wisteria bloomed over the trellis and covered the cracks in the walls. People saw the flowers. They never saw what bloomed inside. Back then, I'd sit on the top step after school, legs dangling, backpack still on, hoping the neighbors might notice me and ask how I was. No one ever did. They waved from behind garden gates. They smiled and complimented my mother's roses, but their eyes skipped past me, as if I were part of the stucco. My mother's roses won ribbons. She clipped them with care, wore gloves and hummed while she worked. She treated her plants with a tenderness she never spared for people, especially not for me. The summer after my father left, the garden flourished. I didn't. He had walked, out without a backward glance. He didn't write. He didn't send money. It was as if he had been swallowed by the land, and the earth had agreed not to speak of him again. And so my mother took all the things she couldn't say to him and pressed them into me instead. "You chew like him," she snapped one night over a plate of cold lentils. "You walk like him, shoulders loose like a man with no spine. Wipe that look off your face. You think your little pout makes you innocent." I didn't know what I looked like, not really. We didn't have many mirrors in the house, and the ones we did have were hung too high for a child to see much more than a blur. But I started to feel the shape of myself through her eyes. A nose too sharp, a jaw that tensed when afraid, and worst of all, my father's eyes. Dark, unreadable, and always watching. That was when the hitting began. The first time wasn't dramatic. There was no thunderclap, no shattering of glass. Just a quiet slap across the cheek after I dropped a ceramic mug in the sink. "You do things carelessly," she muttered, almost with sadness. Just like him. My cheek burned for minutes, but the silence that followed lasted days. I thought it was a punishment for clumsiness, a warning, but in time I realized it was something more primitive, less about what I had done and more about what I was. A vessel for every resentment she could not pour elsewhere. She never raised her voice, never screamed. She struck with the stillness of someone folding laundry, methodical, automatic. The wooden spoon came next, then the broom handle, then fists, then, eventually, whatever was closest. I learned to anticipate them. Not the way one anticipates a storm, but the way one learns the patterns of a fever, how it breaks, how it returns. The bruises bloomed in, places a school blouse would cover. Her skill was in her precision. Her pride was in never being found out. Once, a teacher touched my wrist as I handed in homework and paused. Her eyes flicked to mine. I held my breath. Did you fall? She asked gently. I nodded, and for a moment, I think we both knew it was a lie. But she smiled and handed me back my paper. Try to be more careful, Rose. At night, I pressed cool cloths to my skin and whispered to myself, not prayers, not really, just words. You're here, you're not gone yet. You're still Rose. It became my own litany of survival. Sometimes, I thought of my father and wondered if he had known what he was leaving me with. Had he guessed what she might become without someone to watch her? Or maybe he knew and left anyway. There's a peculiar kind of grief that comes from missing someone who never missed you. I used to picture him in Rome or Milan, sipping espresso, folding a newspaper, perhaps even with a new family. A daughter he didn't flinch from. A girl with a smile he liked. If he did think of me, perhaps he comforted himself with the idea that I was safe with her. But I wasn't, and I knew, even then, that silence could kill a child, slowly, more slowly than fists perhaps, but just as deeply. When I was 9, she made me stop singing. I had picked up the habit from school. Simple songs we learned for a church festival. I sang them while sweeping the kitchen. That afternoon, her shadow filled the doorway behind me. Stop that racket. I'm sorry, I whispered. It's just a song for St. Lucia. She came closer. Do you think your voice is beautiful? She asked. I said nothing. Well, it isn't. It's shrill, grating. Don't open your mouth unless it's to answer me. I never sang again. Children believe what they're told, especially when the words come from someone who tucks them into bed. And so, I began to believe I was hard to love, unpleasant to be around, that there was something inherently wrong with me that drove people away, first my father, then my mother, and eventually, even the teachers who turned the other way. I stopped looking in mirrors. I stopped making friends. I made myself small like a bird folding in its wings to fit inside a cage built for another kind of creature. And through it all, she smiled for the neighbors, handed out pastries at the parish bake sale, and wore lace. Gloves to mass as if grace came stitched into the fabric. Your mother is so elegant, people said. I learned that elegance is the easiest costume for cruelty. All you need is a pressed blouse, a knowing smile, and a daughter who never speaks. But I kept breathing. I kept watching. I kept listening. Even then, something in me refused to die. By the time I turned 10, I understood that my mother didn't just dislike me. She resented that I existed. It wasn't a sudden thing. Hatred rarely announces itself with fanfare. It seeps in slowly, like mold in the corners of a room you forget to look at. At first, it was the way she corrected my posture, yanked the brush through my curls without warning, criticized the way I held my spoon. Later, it was in the silence that followed any sign of joy. A drawing I brought home from school was met with a cold nod. A story I wrote about birds was tossed into the stove before I could explain what it meant. You think too much, she said once. No man wants a girl with thoughts rattling around like coins in a jar. I stopped telling her stories. I told them to the walls instead. I don't know what my mother dreamed of becoming. She never told me. The only time she spoke of the past was with bitterness. I could have married someone else, she muttered once while wringing laundry at the basin. Someone with more sense, more money, but I chose your father. And then you came. I didn't ask if she loved him. I didn't dare. But I watched her eyes whenever his name came up tight, glassy, unreadable. There was something tangled there, something she refused to name. Maybe it was shame. Maybe she blamed me for how it all ended. Maybe, in some broken logic, I had become the thing that trapped her in a life she no longer wanted. And so, I became her punishment. Her rage wasn't loud. She never threw plates. She never screamed in the street. But her fury was patient and calculating. It waited for solitude. It thrived in the quiet hours when no one was watching. Once, during a summer heat wave, I fainted in church. I hadn't eaten since the night before. My knees buckled just after the Gloria. The priest rushed down from the altar. The pews gasped up. My mother took my arm with the delicacy of a porcelain doll and whispered through clenched teeth, "You've embarrassed me." That evening she made me kneel on raw rice in the pantry until my legs went numb. "This is what humiliation feels like," she said, closing the door. I bit the inside of my cheek to stay quiet. It tasted like copper and resolve. I don't remember crying much after that, not because the pain stopped, but because I learned that tears fed her. She wanted the collapse. It gave her power. So I gave her silence instead. It was the only power I had, that even silence can turn into a cage. After years of it, you begin to lose the memory of your own voice. You start to wonder if your thoughts are real or just echoes of the things you've been told. At school, I became the quiet girl in the third row, always on time, never a problem. I kept my hands folded and eyes down. When the teacher called on me, I answered politely, precisely, and just enough to avoid further attention. Children are smart. They sense when someone carries something heavy. They don't always understand it, but they give it space. I was left alone during recess. No one mocked me, but no one invited me to join their games either. Except for Anna. She sat beside me in art class and lent me a green crayon the day mine broke. She smelled like soap and almonds and had the kind of easy smile that made you feel safe. "Wanna come to my house sometime?" she asked, without ceremony. The question stunned me. I hesitated, then lied. "My mother doesn't let me visit." She tilted her head, confused. "Why not?" I didn't know how to answer. So I shrugged and went back to coloring my paper sky too dark. She never asked again. That she started sliding me extra cookies at lunch. She didn't talk much, just sat beside. And that, in its own quiet way, became a lifeline. Children, like seeds, don't need much to grow. A bit of light, a sip of water, someone to believe in their right to exist. That same week, I brought home a permission slip for the school choir. I knew better. I knew what her answer would be, but part of me, a tiny, desperate part, thought maybe she'd say yes. She didn't. Look up from her sewing. "Why would they want you to sing?" she asked. I thought, "Maybe I'm good," I said, my voice barely audible. She scoffed. "You're good at being a burden. That's enough." That night, I crept into the kitchen and opened the trash bin. My drawing was there. Crumpled. Torn. Stained with the dregs of coffee grounds. It wasn't about singing. It never had been. It was about denying me access to joy. About reminding me that I belonged to her, not to myself. And yet, even then, didn't give up the song. I hummed beneath my breath while sweeping the floor. I tapped rhythms into the wood when no one was near. Music became the thread I followed through the dark. She caught me humming once, slapped me across the ear so hard it rang for days. "No more music," she said. "Not in my house." But I kept the songs anyway. I stored them behind my ribs, curled them like petals in the dark. They would bloom later. When I was 11, my body began to change. Not in the magical, celebrated way girls are told to expect, but quietly, with confusion and dread. I didn't welcome it. I didn't understand it. There was no ceremony in my house for the beginning of womanhood. No motherly talk. No warm bath or gentle towel or whispered reassurance. There was only a red stain on the back of my underclothes, and a sharp slap across the cheek when my mother discovered them soaking in the wash basin. "You disgusting thing," she muttered, eyes narrowing. "Already? You're barely decent as a child." She didn't explain what was happening. Didn't ask if I was frightened. I had read about it in school, from leaflets passed around by the older girls, and one awkward afternoon in a church basement where the nurse talked in code. Still, nothing prepared me for the shame that bloomed deeper than blood. She didn't buy me pads. I used rags, torn from an old pillowcase, and rinsed them in secret. I hid them under my mattress in a metal tin that once held sewing needles. When I ran out of cloth, I tore the lining from my winter coat and used that instead. The seams never quite recovered. She never spoke of it again. She didn't need to. Every time she looked at me, I felt her disgust. I was no longer just a reminder of my father. I was now a woman in formation. Something dangerous. Something she could not control. The bruises came quicker after that. Not just punishment, but containment. As if she feared the shape I was growing into. "You walk with too much swing in your hips," she once said, grabbing my arm so hard it left a dark stripe for a week. "Don't flirt with the baker's boy." I hadn't said a word to the baker's boy. I barely looked anyone in the eye. But it didn't matter. My mere existence in a changing body became evidence of seduction. I began to hunch, to walk with shoulders forward, as if apologizing for taking up space. I wore sweaters 3 sizes too big. I scrubbed my skin with vinegar, convinced I could dull whatever scent she hated. One morning, I found that she had sewn the hems of my skirts longer in the night. "No one needs to see your knees," she muttered over coffee. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I only nodded and packed my school bag. There's a particular ache in being treated as both invisible and dangerous. To be unwanted and feared. To be nothing and too much. That was the paradox I lived in. A girl simultaneously erased and punished for being seen. The worst part was, I began to believe her. I watched other girls laugh in the schoolyard, tossing their hair, and pulling each other's sleeves in delight. I studied their ease like it was a foreign language. Their bodies did not betray them. Their mothers waited at the gates with plastic-wrapped sandwiches and kisses on the forehead. Mine never came. She didn't trust me to come home alone either. Not out of concern but control. I had to walk straight back after school and recite every detail of my day. What did you eat? Who did you sit next to? Did any boys talk to you? The questions came sharp, rapid, always ending with, "If I catch you lying." There was no need to finish the sentence. I had memorized her vocabulary of punishment by then. One Sunday, after church, she caught me looking at a painting above the altar Saint Cecilia. Eyes lifted in rapture, hands resting on the strings of a harp. She grabbed my wrist and whispered with contempt, "That's not for girls like you." I didn't know what she meant, only that she was wrong. I wanted to ask why she hated me, why she resented everything I hadn't chosen. My face, my voice, the timing of my blood. But children don't ask those things. Not when they've learned the answer is pain. So I stayed quiet. I continued to do well in school. I memorized poetry. I copied music notes in the margins of my notebooks. I never spoke of what happened at home. Until one day, I collapsed. It was a Thursday. Hot, dry, and still. I hadn't eaten since Tuesday evening. She had withheld dinner as punishment for a sock. She said I hadn't folded properly. Breakfast never came. At school, I stood up too quickly. and everything went white. I woke up in the nurse's office, with the headmistress leaning over me. "She's dehydrated," the nurse said. "Thin as a matchstick." My mother was called. She arrived with perfect hair and an air of annoyance. She scolded me in front of the nurse for being dramatic. "She always does this for attention," she said. The nurse hesitated, then looked at me directly. "Do you get enough food at home, Rose?" I swallowed. My lips were cracked, not my mother's eyes bored into mine. The silent threat behind them was unmistakable. Yes, I said. "I'm just clumsy." That evening she made me stand in the hallway, arms raised, for over an hour. This is what happens when you embarrass me. I don't remember if I cried, but I remember the silence. I remember counting heartbeats and telling myself, if I can survive this, I can survive anything. That was the year the world shrank to a single thought: make it to 16. Make it to the age when you can leave Dot. No one ever tells you how long 5 years can feel when each day is a war. When I think back to that year, 12 years old, between girlhood and shadow, it wasn't one moment that changed me, but a series. Of near-misses. There was the day the postman saw me flinch when my mother brushed past. He paused, frowning, and asked if I was all right. I told him I'd tripped in the garden. He nodded reluctantly and handed me the letters. They smelled faintly of lavender. I held them longer than I needed to, pretending the scent belonged to someone else's house. There was the evening a neighbor brought over a tray of fresh biscotti and remarked how quiet I always was. "Like a little nun," she said, chuckling. My mother laughed politely and added, "She doesn't cause trouble, thank God." I stood beside the doorframe, invisible and obedient. Later that night, the tray shattered across the sink because I forgot to scrub it clean. My cheek burned for hours. And then there was the day the music teacher didn't look away. Her name was Signora Marchetti. She wore perfume that reminded me of bitter oranges and always wore brooches shaped like birds. She played the piano like someone speaking a second language fluently. I liked her immediately. Once a week, she visited the school and worked with the older students. I wasn't meant to be in her class. But one Thursday, the regular teacher was absent, and they filled the schedule with a combined music session. I sat in the back, unsure if I was supposed to sing or pretend I didn't exist. She saw me immediately. "You," she said, pointing to me after the warm-up. "Second row, brown cardigan." "What's your name?" I hesitated. "Rose." "Do you sing, Rose?" I glanced at the floor. "Only in my head." She smiled, not mocking, just curious. "Then let's bring it out." I didn't stand. I didn't move. But something shifted inside me. A small wire, long rusted, trembled at her voice. I didn't sing that day. But I watched. I listened. And I began to believe there was a version of me who might someday say yes. After that, she started greeting me by name in the hallway. Nothing grand, just "Buongiorno, Rose," as if I were worth seeing. It startled me every time. She didn't ask personal questions. She never pried. But when I lingered after class once, pretending to fix the chairs, she said gently, "Sometimes music is the only place we're allowed to be loud." I nodded. My throat tightened with unshed words. She didn't push. That weekend, I tried to sing again. Just a whisper. In the attic, where the insulation muffled sound, and the dust seemed to approve of secrets. I found my father's old songbook hidden in a drawer full of folk melodies and handwritten lyrics. I didn't remember his voice, but I remembered the feeling of him humming through walls before he left. I turned the pages like they might crack. I chose a lullaby. The words were simple. I mouthed them first. Then I let them out, just enough for the air to carry. My voice was unsteady, thin. But it was mine. It felt like striking a match in a dark cathedral. Tiny, inadequate and holy. I didn't tell anyone, especially not her. That something in me opened. A sliver of defiance I didn't know I had. Next week, I borrowed a second-hand recorder from the school cupboard and practiced in the attic. I played with shaking hands. The notes wavered, wobbled, but the act itself made the air feel less cruel. Of course, I was caught. One afternoon, I left the recorder wrapped in a scarf at the back of my drawer, thinking she'd never notice. But she always did. "What's this?" she asked, holding it by the mouthpiece like a contaminated object. "It's from school," I said. "Only for practice. I'm careful." She narrowed her eyes. "You think you'll get out of here with songs?" I didn't answer. There was no correct reply. She turned, walked to the fireplace, and snapped the recorder in two against the hearth. "Music is not for girls like you," she said. "Stop pretending you're special." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain against the tiles. I didn't cry. I wasn't surprised, but I felt something rising that I didn't know how to name. It wasn't hate. Not exactly. It was the clarity that she would never change. And I would have to survive her. I began to prepare. Not in any heroic way, not with bags packed or escape plans. But I started building an inner room, a space in my mind where she could not follow. I imagined it often a small chapel made of cedar and silence, with high windows and a locked door. Inside, I kept every song I remembered, every note I hummed in secret, every name I wished someone would call me with kindness. And every time she struck, I went there. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Even now, decades later, I return to that room, not out of habit, out of reverence. It was my first sanctuary, my first rebellion. The door was never fully closed. The winter I turned 13 was colder than most. The pipes in the back room froze twice, and the air in the house held the smell of damp wool and mildew. I'd grown used to wearing layers, not for warmth, but to pad the places that bruised too easily. My mother noticed. She made me undress before I left for school that February morning, stripping off my extra blouse, my second pair of socks. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" she said flatly. "Making yourself look pitiful, trying to get attention from the teachers." I stood in silence, feet bare on the cold tile. She reached for the belt that hung from a hook by the pantry and laid it on the table in front of me. She didn't need to use it. The threat alone was enough. That was the new method, refined, calculated. Bruises were manageable. Fear did the rest. I walked to school shivering, coat thin, the wind biting through the weave. My hands were red by the time I reached the main gate, and I kept them in my sleeves as much as I could, fingers curled into fists for heat. The pain didn't bother me as much as the knowing that this was what she wanted, to send me into the world exposed, small, contained. But something inside me had begun to harden, not into hatred, not yet, but into resistance. That day I skipped lunch and stayed behind in the music room. Signora Marchetti was cleaning out a cabinet and humming to herself an aria I recognized but couldn't name. "You're not with your classmates?" she asked without looking up. "I'm not hungry," I said, truthfully. She studied me for a moment, then gestured to the bench beside her. I sat. We didn't speak for several minutes. I think she understood what silence could hold, what it could protect. "I had a sister," she said finally, her voice low. "She used to sing when she was frightened, just under her breath, like a little shield." I turned my face slightly toward her. "She died young," she added with no embellishment. I'm sorry. She used to say music was the only thing in the house that didn't hurt her. There was a pause. It doesn't hurt me either, I whispered. That afternoon, she handed me a thin book of sheet music Italian lullabies, hand-copied and bound with thread. It's yours, she said. Keep it hidden, if you must. But don't forget the notes. I still have that book. It lives in the drawer beside my bed now, under a scarf of linen so soft it feels like apology. By early spring, I knew I would not survive another year in that house unchanged. I had begun shrinking inward in ways I feared were permanent. No laughter, no confidence, a suspicion of kindness so deep I flinched when the priest shook my hand. After Mass, I watched other girls bloom while I withered in the soil of secrets. Then came the night. The vase shattered. It was a small thing. Really a family heirloom, she said. Though I never saw it displayed. I had knocked it off the shelf. While dusting, trying to do something right for once. The sound of it breaking was sharp, violent, final. I froze. She entered the room with her arms folded, her face a mask of quiet rage. You think you're clever? She said, trying to rid this house of what belongs to me. It was an accident, I said too quickly. Liar. She stepped toward me. Her hand rose, but I didn't flinch this time. I held my ground, eyes locked on hers. I'm not afraid of you, I said. It wasn't true. Not entirely, but it was the first time I'd said something she couldn't twist. Her hand fell slowly. She stared at me for a long time. Then, without another word, she turned and left the room. I stood alone, glass crunching beneath my shoes, my breath trembling in my throat. That moment changed something between us. Not because she softened, she didn't, but because I had stepped outside the script. I had refused to act the part of the punished child. From then on, the violence became less frequent, the threats more strategic, but the contempt deepened. Her words grew colder, laced with ridicule instead of rage. You'll never be more than this, she said once. No man will want a girl with that mouth and that past. I was beginning to understand that I didn't want to be wanted. I wanted to be free. I started saving the coins I found in the street, slipping them into the hem of my mattress. I noted bus routes, memorized schedules. I began watching the older girls in town, how they moved, how they spoke, how they left. One afternoon, I passed a travel poster on the window of a shop. A girl on a bicycle in Florence, wind in her hair, arms outstretched like she owned the road. I stood there for 10 minutes staring until the shopkeeper came out and asked if I was lost. No, I thought. Not yet, but soon. At night, I began to dream of escape, not in fairy tale ways, in practical, methodical details. Where to go, what to pack, how to lie if asked. I practiced my face in the mirror. I could smile on command now. It no longer reached my eyes, but it passed inspection. And each morning I made my bed with more care than the day before, because I understood at last that it might become my final goodbye. By the time I turned 14, I had developed the peculiar ability to disappear inside myself while still being in the room. I could sit at the table across from my mother and nod, respond in short phrases, even smile if required, and yet be miles away in thought, constructing alternate futures in my head. I imagined myself living in Florence, like the girl in the travel poster. I pictured a small apartment above a bakery, where I would wake each morning to the smell of fresh bread, not fear. In these daydreams, I was older, untouchable. My name stayed the same, but everything else about me was unrecognizable, free, joyful, whole. But no matter how far I drifted, the mirror always brought me back. It was a rectangular shard of old glass nailed crookedly to the bedroom wall. Its edges had gone cloudy, and a crack split through the lower half like lightning trapped in time. It distorted everything: my eyes, my shoulders, my posture. It took the truth and twisted it just enough to match what my mother always said. "You look just like him," she muttered once, passing behind me while I washed my face. Same nose, same smug mouth. I looked into the glass, trying to see what she saw. I didn't remember my father well. He left when I was 8, and even before then, he was more of a presence than a person. A scent of tobacco, a coat hung near the door, a half-sung tune behind closed doors. But I knew I had his eyes. Almond-shaped, a little too intense. And I had his stubbornness, apparently. That was the worst sin in my mother's book. "You think you're better than me," she spat once, not long after I corrected a priest at Mass about the Latin conjugation for "to be sent." "I don't," I said quietly. "You do. You carry yourself like you know things. But knowing doesn't keep you warm. It doesn't put food on the table." What she meant was that intelligence had betrayed her. It hadn't saved her marriage, hadn't protected her from the gossip that followed my father's departure. People had assumed he left because of her temper, and while they weren't wrong, she'd been wounded by the implication. She would never forgive me for being living evidence of that shame. By mid-spring, I began to avoid the mirror altogether. I no longer looked myself in the eye when brushing my hair. I washed my face in the basin with my gaze lowered. I began to feel as if I was slipping out of my own skin, becoming someone else entirely, or worse, no one at all. But one Sunday, something unexpected happened. I was sent to the grocer's for bread and soap. On the way home, I passed the antique shop I always hurried by. The window was usually dusty, filled with porcelain angels and cracked plates. But that day, something caught my eye. A mirror. Round, gold-rimmed, the kind you might find in a dressing room in another century. Its surface was clean, and for once it reflected clearly. I paused. And then I saw her. Me. Not distorted, not warped by clouded glass or someone else's anger. Just me. A young girl with tired eyes and a tightly braided crown of curls. Cheeks a little hollow, but present. Real. Human. I stood frozen, unable to move. The shopkeeper appeared behind the glass, a middle-aged woman in a lavender shawl, and smiled at me. Not pitifully, just a kind, open smile. "You like it?" she mouthed through the pane. I nodded. She opened the door with a soft jingle. "You can come look properly," she offered. I hesitated. Then, clutching the brown paper bag to my chest, I stepped inside. The shop smelled of old paper and beeswax. The mirror sat propped on a shelf between a rusted lamp and a stack of sheet music. "Go ahead," she said, gesturing gently. I stood before it. I didn't speak. "What's your name, dear?" "Rose." "That's a strong name," she said. "You know, even roses have thorns." I didn't answer, but I didn't look away either. She didn't ask questions, didn't press. After a while, she turned and let me be. I stared at myself for several minutes, not admiring, not criticizing, just recognizing. When I left, I didn't feel healed, but I felt seen. By myself, for the first time in years. At home, I said nothing about the shop. I tucked the memory into my chest like a note passed in class. That night, as I passed the hallway mirror, I stopped. My reflection in that old glass still carried the crack down the middle. But I looked at it longer than usual, and before I left, I whispered to the girl inside, "I know you're still in there. It was a small thing, but it was a beginning. There was a time I thought I might leave without saying a word. That silence would be both my shield and my punishment. But that spring, a new figure stepped into my life, one I didn't expect. And without raising her voice, she showed me what it meant to be heard. Her name was Mrs. Lucia Patterson. not Italian, though she wore the name like a borrowed coat that had grown comfortable. She was the new English literature teacher at school, tall and soft-spoken, with olive skin, and a streak of grey in her black hair that curled just at her temple. The girls whispered that she had lost her husband in the war and come to Italy to start over. We were reading Jane Eyre that term. I found myself copying lines from the margins into the backs of my notebooks. Sentences about locked rooms and women who screamed into pillows. The story felt familiar in ways I couldn't admit out loud. Mrs. Patterson noticed I was quiet, but not inattentive. She began calling on me gently in class, not to embarrass, just to include. I'd answer in low tones, watching my words carefully, but I felt something strange every time she nodded at me. A warmth, like sunlight touching a part of me long kept in shadow. One day, after a lesson about character and resilience, she asked us to write a private reflection. "Tell me about a time you felt voiceless," she said. "Or a time you chose." Silence. She promised we wouldn't have to share them aloud. Only she would read them. I hesitated. At home, I stared at the blank page for hours. I wrote nothing that night. But the next morning I woke early and sat by the kitchen window. With my pencil, I wrote, "Sometimes silence isn't a choice. It's a sentence. And sometimes it's the only thing that makes you feel safe enough to keep breathing." I know this because I've lived in rooms where sound was punished, and the cost of speaking was too high. But I still listen. I still hear everything. One day, maybe I'll speak it too. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. I slipped the paper into her box like a secret. For a week, she said nothing. Then one afternoon, she stopped me in the hallway. "Rose," she said quietly, her eyes warm. "Your writing moved me." I stiffened. "I won't ask if it's true," she added. "But I want you to know I believe you." My breath caught. She continued, "If you ever need a place to speak safely, my door is open." I nodded. I couldn't meet her eyes. But I held those words for days, rolling them around like stones. In my pocket. That night, my mother noticed something in my posture. She accused me of hiding something. "You've got secrets, I can tell." "No," I said quickly. "Nothing." She narrowed her eyes. "You're not smart enough to keep things from me." And just like that, my courage slipped. I remembered the crack of the belt, the sting of words, the humiliation of being called a liar when I spoke truth. But a seed had already been planted. At school, Mrs. Patterson started leaving books on my desk without a word. The Diary of Anne Frank, The Bell Jar. Stories of girls who spoke, even when it cost them. I read them under my blankets at night with a flashlight borrowed from a friend. Each line felt like a breath I'd been holding for too long. She never pressed me to talk. But once, during lunch, she sat beside me in the library and said, "Sometimes the people we live with cannot love us the way we deserve. That doesn't mean we are unlovable." It was such a simple sentence. I bit my lip, trying to swallow something that had been rising for weeks. But if no one sees it, does it still count? She looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, especially then." I didn't answer. But later that day, I passed her classroom and saw her alone, packing books into her satchel. I hovered at the door. "I like the way you read aloud," I said. She turned. "Thank you. I've never read Jane Eyre before, but I think I understand her." She smiled, full and slow. "You would." I wanted to say more. I wanted to tell her about the attic, about the music I wasn't allowed to play anymore, about the bruises I kept hidden under sleeves. I wanted to say that I hated my own face sometimes, because it looked too much like the man who vanished, that I didn't know if I would survive to see 16. But I said none of it. Instead, I stepped forward and asked, "Can I borrow another book?" She opened her bag and handed me I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. "I think you're ready," she said. I walked home that afternoon with the book, pressed to my chest like it might guard me from whatever waited at the kitchen door. I didn't speak to her again for 2 weeks. But I returned the book with a note tucked inside. "Thank you for seeing me. It was the first time." I used those words. It would not be the last. I have never told anyone this part, not fully. Not even the family who now fills my kitchen on holidays, who kiss my cheeks and call me strong. It's one thing to recall pain with distance, another to admit how close I came to vanishing altogether. I was 15, a season caught between endings, and not yet beginnings. The bruises had faded by then, but something inside me was cracking in places no one could see. I had come to understand the mechanics of survival, how to anticipate my mother's moods, how to lie just convincingly enough to keep suspicion at bay, how to smile in class when inside I was curled in a corner. But knowing how to survive is not the same as wanting to live. There was a cliff outside town, past the railway and the olive groves. It wasn't high enough to make headlines, but high enough that people knew to be careful. Children dared each other to stand at the edge. Lovers carved initials into its stone. I had gone there once as a child with my father, who let me toss pebbles and count the seconds before they hit the stream below. That memory returned to me one heavy morning when I couldn't get out of bed. The house was quiet, which meant she was gone, likely to market or mass, depending on what mask she needed that day. I dressed slowly, not with purpose, more like muscle memory. I left the house without breakfast, without my books, without even locking the door behind me. I walked past the bakery, past the church steps, past the square where the fountain no longer worked. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. The path to the cliff was overgrown with wildflowers and dry grass. I remember the scent of sage and something sharp, juniper, maybe. The sun was high, but the wind made everything feel distant, like I was walking through a memory instead of a place. When I reached the edge, I stood still for a long time. Not crying, not raging, just listening. The world was so loud with silence. There, birds calling in the trees below, water rushing somewhere far beneath. My heart like a distant drum. I looked down. The drop wasn't clean. Rocks jutted out like crooked teeth. The stream twisted through them, fast and silver. A poor place to end something, I thought. Even my despair had a sense of practicality. I sat on the edge, arms wrapped around my knees. What stopped me wasn't a voice. It wasn't a memory or divine vision. It was something quieter. A sentence from Mrs. Patterson, recalled without warning. "You're a bright girl, Rose. You have a future." She had said it weeks earlier, as I fumbled through a reading aloud in class. I hadn't believed her then. But now, on the edge of something final, her words came back with weight. A future. Not a promise, but a possibility. I began to cry, not from sorrow, but exhaustion. All the pretending, all the silence, all the effort to be invisible. And still, I was made to carry shame that wasn't mine. I cried for the girl who never got to sing, for the books I'd hidden, for the mirror that told me I was someone too. Hate. And then I said it aloud for the first time. It wasn't my fault. The wind carried the words away like petals. It wasn't a miracle. It didn't lift the weight completely, but it shifted it just enough. Enough to make me stand. I didn't go home right away. I wandered, found a bench in town and sat for over an hour, my face still wet, my body hollowed out. Eventually, the librarian passed by and nodded politely. She didn't ask questions, just handed me a folded flyer from her bag. "Poetry reading," she said. "Next week." Young writers welcome. She kept walking before I could reply. I pressed the flyer between my palms like a fragile offering. That night, I returned home quietly. My mother was in the kitchen, slicing carrots with sharp, deliberate motions. "Where have you been?" she asked without turning. "Walking." She didn't press. I didn't offer more. But something had changed. In me. Not defiance. Not yet. But a refusal. A line I had drawn silently, somewhere deep, that said, "You don't get to decide how I end. And from that moment on, every kindness I allowed myself, every song I hummed, every page I read, every quiet thought I wrote down was a rebellion. A small light, flickering stubbornly against the wind. The Monday after the cliff, I returned to school with a strange steadiness in my step. Like someone who had looked into a dark room and finally closed the door. Behind her, I wasn't healed, not yet. But something essential had been decided. I wouldn't vanish. Not now. Not like that. Mrs. Patterson noticed. She didn't say a word during class, but her eyes lingered on mine longer than usual. When the final bell rang and my classmates spilled into the hallways in their usual loud bursts of chatter, I stayed behind. My palms were damp, my throat dry, but the decision had already been made. She looked up from her desk and smiled gently. "Rose, I need to tell you something," I said, and was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. She nodded once. "Come in." I sat in the chair beside her desk, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The clock ticked. A breeze stirred the papers pinned to the notice board, and still, for a moment, I said nothing. Then I opened my mouth, and the words came. "I've been hurt." That's all I could say at first. But it was enough. Mrs. Patterson didn't ask. "By who?" She didn't press or lean in with wide-eyed sympathy. She simply placed her hand on the desk, palm up. In silent solidarity, I went on. I told her about the mirror, the belt, the cold silences and the sharp words that followed me through every room in the house. I told her how my mother called me a curse, a ghost, a punishment sent to remind her of the man who abandoned her. I told her how I stopped looking at my own face, how I memorized bus routes and hid coins in a pillowcase, how some days I stood by the door for hours, wondering if today would be the day I left forever. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but the tears had already come days before, at the cliff's edge. What remained now was something heavier, but clearer. Like finally putting a name to a disease after years of symptoms. When I stopped speaking, the room felt different, as though the air had shifted, or the world had grown quieter in reverence for what had just been released. Mrs. Patterson's voice was calm. "Rose, I believe you." 4 words, but they struck harder than any slap I'd ever received. Not because they surprised me, but because no one had ever offered them before. She leaned forward slightly. "What's happening to you is not your fault. You did not cause it, and you do not deserve it." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. "My father used to hit my mother," she said, so gently it felt like a confession. "He never laid a hand on me, but the house was full of screaming, and silence, and shame. I know what it does to a girl." I blinked, stunned by the quiet way she'd offered her own pain, not to outdo mine, not to redirect it, just to say, "You're not alone. What happens now?" I asked. "We get help." She explained that she would call someone from social services, that it wouldn't happen all at once, but there were steps we could take. Safe steps. I wouldn't be left to face this alone. We could document things, keep records. If I was willing, She would walk with me through each part, but my first instinct was fear. My mother's voice still echoed in my head. If you tell anyone, they'll never believe you. They'll send you away. You'll be nothing. But Mrs. Patterson's eyes were steady, and I realized I wanted to believe her more than I feared believing my mother. I'll do it, I said. I just need a little more time. She nodded. Of course. Before I left, she handed me a small spiral notebook. Write it all down, she said. Everything you remember. Dates, words, how you felt, even if it's just a single sentence a day. That way, the truth has somewhere to live. I clutched it like a life raft. Walking home that day felt different. I passed the fountain in the square, now repaired, water trickling gently over the stone. A child tossed in a coin and made a wish. I didn't stop, but I whispered something as I passed. Let this be the beginning. At home, the house was quiet again. My mother was in the living room watching television, her slippers tapping rhythmically against the floor. You're late, she muttered without looking at me. I stayed to talk to a teacher. She glanced at me then, suspicious. What about? Homework, I lied smoothly. She grunted and turned back to the screen. But I had said it. I had told the truth to someone, and that truth had been received without shame. That night, I sat at my desk and opened the notebook. I wrote, April 3rd. I said it out loud. I told someone. And they believed me. I am not invisible. I closed the book and hid it under the loose floorboard beneath my bed. Slept through the night without waking in fear. In the weeks that followed, the notebook became my second voice. Each night, after the house fell into its practiced hush and my mother's footsteps had faded into sleep, I would lift the loose floorboard and retrieve it. I wrote not just what happened, but how it felt. The patterns of her rage, the words she used, the way her eyes hardened when she looked at me. I described the rooms where the worst things occurred, as if anchoring memory in architecture might somehow free me from its trap. Mrs. Patterson read every page without comment, only quiet underlining and pencil a line here. A date circled there. Her calm never wavered. She never gave me false comfort. But her steadiness was its own sort of lighthouse, guiding me toward a different shore. We're almost there, she told me one afternoon, as I stood in her classroom after school. Shutters were half closed, casting golden stripes across the floor. The counselor from social services will meet us next week. She wants to talk with you. You won't be alone. Will they take me away? I asked. No one will drag you anywhere, but they can help make sure you have a place to go when you're ready. I nodded, clutching the strap of my satchel. What if my mother finds out? We're being careful, she said. But if she does, we'll act quickly. We've already arranged temporary placement. Somewhere safe. Somewhere safe. The idea felt both impossible and intoxicating. I'd never been anywhere that wasn't watched, that wasn't tense with the threat of eruption. The closest thing to peace I'd known had been books and brief escapes to the hilltop, neither of which came with a lock or a key. The next few days passed like the breath before a leap. At school, I moved like a ghost with a destination. At home, I made myself small, obedient, forgettable. I folded the laundry before being asked. I stirred soup in silence. I avoided mirrors and prayed for silence. But the house always had a way of sensing hope and reacting violently to it. It was a Friday evening when she found the notebook. I had hidden it well under the floorboard, beneath a sheet of newspaper from the year I was born. But I'd been careless. I'd left the board askew, and she had noticed. I came home to find the notebook open on the kitchen table, its pages bent and smudged from her hands. My mother stood beside it, holding a wooden spoon like a scepter. What is this? She asked. her voice low and taut with venom. I didn't answer. She slammed her palm on the notebook, shaking the salt cellar beside it. Answer me. I stood frozen, heart hammering against my ribs. It's mine. She stepped closer. Who have you been talking to? That teacher? Are you trying to ruin me? No, I whispered. I gave you a roof. I fed you. And this is how you repay me, lies. They're not lies, I said, more to myself than to her. She struck me across the face. The blow wasn't the worst she'd ever delivered. But the shame in her eyes, it wasn't rage. It was something smaller, pettier, fear, perhaps. She knew something was slipping from her grasp. She leaned in close, her breath thick with bitterness. You are nothing without me. You'd be on the streets. I didn't respond. Not because I agreed, but because I no longer needed her to. Hear me. She snatched the notebook and moved to the stove. I watched as she lifted the lid of the iron pot and threatened to drop it in. I'll burn every page, she said. I'll erase your little fantasies. My voice came back to me, surprisingly calm. It's already been copied. A lie, but a necessary one. She paused, uncertain. Then she threw the notebook to the floor, not into the fire. She stormed down the hallway and slammed her bedroom door. I stood in the kitchen alone, shaking. Not with fear, but with a strange, rising clarity. It was time. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my clothes, satchel packed and shoes by the door. At dawn, I slipped out while she still slept. Notebook tucked under my arm. Mrs. Patterson met me at the school gates, early and waiting, her coat buttoned up to her chin. I think I'm ready, I said. She nodded, quietly. Then let's begin. We walked together toward the town centre. Not hurried, not hidden. Just two women, one older, one younger, stepping into a future that, for the first time, wasn't shaped by fear. Mrs. Patterson and I arrived at the municipal building just after 8, when the corridor still smelled of fresh polish and yesterday's paper files. The social services counsellor, Signora Bianchi, was waiting with 2 mugs of barley coffee, her silver hair coiled in a braid as thick as rope. She shook my hand like I was already someone worth believing. We spent the morning in a small interview room, grey walls, single window. I sat opposite her and told my story again, this time with dates, page numbers, drawings of the kitchen layout, arrows showing where the belt had hung. She asked careful questions, glancing often at Mrs. Patterson, whose steady presence anchored me like ballast in a rising tide. When I finished, Signora Bianchi closed the file, pressed her palm flat on the cover, and said, "We'll keep you safe now." A plan unfolded with military precision. That very afternoon, an officer from the Carabinieri would escort 2 social workers to my house. They would present an emergency removal order citing physical and psychological endangerment. I would not be there when the door opened. I would be in a temporary placement, a spare bedroom at the librarian's cottage until a longer term. Solution could be arranged. Everything hinged on speed and secrecy. I thought of the notebook crumpled on our kitchen tiles, the wooden spoon clattering like a warning bell. Fear gnawed, but something fiercer pressed beneath it, a hum of inevitability. This was happening because I had spoken, because someone had listened. At noon, we walked to the bus stop behind the basilica. Clouds gathered over Mantova's tiled roofs, the sky a slate lid clamping down. Mrs. Patterson touched my shoulder. "Storms pass, Rose," she murmured. "Let the sky rumble, it's only noise." The librarian, Signora Valli, greeted us with a tremulous smile. Her cottage sat on the edge of town, hidden by fig trees and rose hedges. She led me to a small attic room with a slanted ceiling and a narrow iron bed. A watercolored print of Saint Cecilia hung above the headboard. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I set my satchel on the quilt and exhaled a breath I hadn't realized. We ate warm minestrone in the kitchen, 3 women trading quiet assurances, while thunder rattled distant shutters. At 2 o'clock the phone rang. "Signora," Bianchi's calm voice reported through the line. "Officers en route, order in hand. All proceeding." I thought relief might bloom, but dread unfurled instead, coiling tight around my ribs. My mother's fury was a living thing. Cornering it would not be bloodless. I pictured her in the kitchen, veins rising in her neck, eyes flashing like knives. What would she do when strangers named her violence aloud? The answer arrived sooner than expected. At 3:30 the cottage gate slammed. Rain sprayed through the doorway as the carabinieri sergeant strode in, raincoat dripping. "We need the girl downstairs," he said, removing his cap. "There's been resistance." I followed him to the parlor where Signora Bianchi waited, soaked but composed. She explained, "My mother had refused entry, then attempted to strike the social worker with the belt. The officer intervened. She was now detained for questioning. They needed my statement on record that afternoon to finalize protective custody." We drove through sheets of rain, windshield wipers frantic. I sat in the back seat beside Mrs. Patterson, her hand a quiet anchor around mine. Streets blurred past. The bakery, the silent fountain, the travel poster now waterlogged on its board. Everything familiar. Receding. The patrol car stopped outside our house. Blue lights flashed against the yellow walls, making them look sickly, jaundiced. A crowd of neighbors gathered under umbrellas, whispering. A priest from the parish clutched his collar, disbelief etched into his brow. For years they had praised my mother's roses. Now they watched as 2 officers led her down the path in handcuffs. She wasn't weeping or pleading. She looked feral, hair undone, cheeks blotched, nostrils flaring like a cornered animal. Our eyes met over the hedge. She hissed one sentence at me, low and venomous. "You did this." I held her stare. Rain streamed over my face, indistinguishable from tears. "No," I answered, not loudly, but clearly enough for her, for the priest, for every gawking neighbor. "You did." The sergeant guided me into the kitchen scene of so many silent wars. The belt still lay on the counter, coiled like a dead snake. My notebook, water-stained now, rested beside it. As the social worker photographed bruises on my arms, I noticed how small the room actually was, barely space for the table, the stove, the weight of unspoken dread. The walls that once seemed towering now appeared flimsy, dingy, beatable. Statement given, signatures made, evidence bagged. When I stepped outside, rain had eased to mist. The patrol car carrying my mother turned the corner and disappeared. The crowd melted into doorways. I stood on the front path and inhaled. The garden smelled of wet earth and broken myths. Petals sagged under raindrops like tired eyelids. I touched a wilted rosette's red too, vivid against the grey afternoon, and felt nothing but relief at its imperfection. Mrs. Patterson walked me back to the waiting car. "One more night with Signora Valli," she said. "Tomorrow the tribunal will place you formally. You'll finish school. You'll have choices." Choices. The word fluttered inside my chest like a bird startled awake. That evening in the attic room, I opened the notebook, its pages smeared but legible. I wrote, May 12th. The walls heard. The sky spoke. And today, the world believed me more than... I am still Rose. And I am free. I set the notebook under St. Cecilia's watchful gaze and climbed into bed. Rain pattered softly on the roof. No longer a threat, but a lullaby. I closed my eyes, knowing the house on Via dei Pioppi would stand empty tonight, its secrets finally dragged into the light. Tomorrow held courts, questions, perhaps new fears, but also mornings without terror, bread without bitterness, songs without consequence. For the first time, sleep came swiftly and stayed. The tribunal hearing took less than an hour, yet it redrew the map of my entire life. I sat beside Signora Bianchi at a long oak table while 3 magistrates in black robes reviewed the photographs, the medical notes, and my notebook now dried and pressed flat like a salvaged flower. They spoke in formal tones, but every so often one of them glanced at me with a softness that felt strangely heavier than pity. When they finished, the presiding judge removed his glasses and said, "Signorina Rosa Ferrenti, the court recognizes your right to safety, education, and dignity. Protective placement is hereby granted." He stamped the order. Wood met paper. Ink met finality. Just like that, the house on Via dei Pioppi no longer had jurisdiction over my breath. For 6 months, I lived with Signora Valli, the librarian. Her cottage smelled of elderflower and old parchment. In the mornings I fed her hens, and in the evenings I shelved returned novels by lamplight. She never asked me to explain nightmares when they startled me awake. She simply left chamomile tea outside my door, steam curling like a hush. Slowly, the tremor in my hands faded. The bruises turned yellow, then vanished. The belt-shaped memory on my skin remained phantom, but less tyrannical by the week. School felt different too. I no longer pressed myself into corners. During recess I sat on the steps with Anna the girl, who once shared her cookies and told her jokes I'd been storing for years. We laughed so loud the mathematics teacher closed his window in a huff. Mrs. Patterson watched from a distance, smiling the way some people pray, quietly, with absolute conviction. One afternoon she approached me in the library. "The regional literature contest is open," she said, placing a leaflet on my desk. "They're asking for personal narratives. I'm not sure I'm ready," I whispered. She tapped the notebook resting beneath my palm. "You've already written it." I spent evenings polishing 3 pages titled "Even the Walls Heard." I expected tears while revising, but instead felt a strange exhilaration like airing linens after a long winter. I submitted the piece and returned to algebra homework, trying not to wonder if anyone besides Mrs. Patterson would ever read my words. Weeks passed. The plum trees bloomed. The day results were posted. I found a single white envelope in my satchel, slipped there by invisible hands. First place. Modest scholarship. An invitation to read aloud at the Civic Theatre. Stage fright turned my stomach to hot stones, but Mrs. Patterson stood in the wings and Anna sat in the front row clutching her own notebook like a talisman. I stepped to the podium, breath shallow, pulse loud. The theatre lights blinded me. Yet for the first time I felt no urge to shrink. My voice sounded older than 15 when I said, "This is for every child who whispered the truth into a pillow and thought no one would ever hear." People rose when I finished, teachers, strangers, even the mathematics master. Applause echoed through the rafters, not thunderous but insistent, like rain that refuses to cease until seeds have drunk their fill. Somewhere above the noise I thought I heard St. Cecilia's imagined harp, no longer mournful, but bright. News travelled. A boarding school in Florence offered a full bursary, room, meals, a conservatory elective in choir. The headmistress wrote, "We believe you will thrive." Among voices allowed to soar. I wept over the acceptance letter, not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar relief of doors opening instead of closing. Leaving Mantova felt different now. I didn't flee in the night. I departed at dawn. Suitcase strapped tight, Signora. Galley waving a handkerchief, Mrs. Patterson beside her with eyes glossy as candle wax. Before the train pulled away, I promised to write every Sunday, and I kept that promise for decades. Florence changed everything. My first morning in the dormitory, I woke to bells from Santa Cruz and realized the sound didn't terrify me. It invited me. I joined the student choir, learned to read sheet music properly, sang alto so rich the maestro called it winter. Sunlight. In history class, I discovered women who'd survived worse than I had, and still carved their names into marble memory. At 18, I auditioned for a small touring ensemble. We sang in parish halls, marketplaces, once even in a vineyard, beneath strung lanterns. After concerts, people pressed my hands and said my voice felt like courage. Each compliment stitched new fabric over the old tear inside me. Letters arrived. 2 legal documents about my mother. After a brief sentence for assault, she moved to a northern town and remarried. I did not write back. Forgiveness, I learned, is not correspondence. It is a garden you tend privately, deciding which weeds to uproot and which to let stand as warning. Years turned. I studied baking between rehearsals, sweet dough rising like proof that warmth can transform. Eventually, I returned to Mantova, opened a tiny pasticceria near the square, and hung my conservatory certificate beside the oven. Children flocked to my window for sugared figs. Tourists lingered for my Turin. They called me Nona Rose long before I had grandchildren of my own. And yes, I married a gentle bookseller who never raised his voice louder than the turning of a page. We had 2 daughters, both taught early that a house is sacred only when every heart inside it is safe. Now, decades later, I stand in that bakery's back room, shaping dough before dawn. My hands no longer shake. Scar tissue has softened beneath time and kneading. The belt's shadow? A faint line memory traces but no longer tightens. I glance at the wall where a framed copy of Even the Walls Heard still hangs. Below it, my first place ribbon has faded to dusty rose, but the ink remains bold. Visitors read it while waiting for their pastries, unaware that the narrator now dusts their canetti with sugar. A tap on the front door interrupts my reverie. It's Anna Gray at the temples. Cheeks flush from the morning chill dropping off fresh lemons from her garden. We share espresso and laugh about schoolgirl secrets, of teachers long retired, of a librarian who still shelves books at 90. When she leaves, I unlock the display case, set the first batch of biscotti in perfect rows, and whisper a line I once wrote in a trembling attic. Bread without bitterness. Today the phrase is not wishful. It's inventory.